Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jayaraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are always glad to have you with us here. You know, last weekend was a ball of chaos around college football, and that got us kind of thinking. Are we seeing signs of more parity in the sport? That's been kind of an ongoing discussion, and what's causing it. Is it a blip? Is it a longer term thing? But we're also going to, maybe also take a second to look at several of the biggest games coming up this weekend and try to focus on one of the big questions for each. But before we dive into all of this, let me remind you, of course, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Wherever you're listening to us, take a second, maybe give us a rating, write a review. We always appreciate it. It means a lot to us. But without further ado, let's dive into it. So, that's a big question. Parity in my college football, is there such a thing? Goes without saying, the last several years, we've seen moments that have caught eyes, like obviously when they were still a member of the G5. We saw Cincy go on a run and reach the college football playoff. We saw TCU inexplicably make it all the way to the college football national championship. Last season, we saw two teams that really we hadn't seen in ages compete for a national title. Washington and Michigan make it all the way to the final in Houston. And of course, this past weekend, we saw chaos that was capped by Vanderbilt, of all teams, knocking off big bad Alabama in just that weird juxtaposition of Alabama knocking off Georgia to losing to Vanderbilt the next week as the number one team. So what are your general thoughts on this? I mean, has this been something that has been percolating for you, Sean, or is this something that you think has been coming up a little more recently?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's been, I guess, percolating for me. And the reason that I say that is coming into the year, I really felt like there was almost a laziness in terms of how we approached, for example, putting together a top 25 or coming up with, contenders for conferences and for national championships. Like, it just felt like a lot of defaults. Michigan at number 9 in the preseason poll, Florida State at number 10. Like, it just felt a lot like, well, we don't know. So we're just going to talk about sort of our familiar names. And when I look back the past couple of years, I mean, the reality is we've seen teams come out of nowhere and also fall out of nowhere almost every single year. And I do feel like this dynamic is changing. And again, when you right now, there are at least 2 teams that have been untouchable this year: Texas and Ohio State. Oregon, you kind of put into that conversation. Penn State, we'll kind of wait and see on them. But everybody else has been vulnerable. And, to look at the preseason AP top 10, we have a team like Alabama that loses to Vanderbilt. We have a team like Georgia where, they lose to Alabama, but they also should have lost to Kentucky earlier this year. Ole Miss, they actually lose to Kentucky. Notre Dame, they lose to Northern Illinois. Michigan, they lose not just to Texas, but lose to Washington. Florida State, obviously, can get into everything that's happened to them since their preseason ranking. So I think that there has been a level where between 15 and 35, there's been a lot of chaos the past couple of years, but it's starting to creep up. It's starting to impact the blue bloods. It's starting to impact the national championship contenders. I'd even make the case that some of that chaos and movement was part of how Michigan was able to clear the rest of college football, was that they were the team that was solid and consistent and improved marginally year over year between 2021 and 2023, while everybody else kind of moved around alongside them. So I do think that there is something to this. And I'm curious to know from both of us, really, why we think that's the case.
Yeah, certainly one of the most common reasons people have cited has been that kind of 1-2 punch of the transfer portal and NIL. And I think the portal, though, has been certainly a big part of it because we look at that Vanderbilt squad and Diego Pavia, who has just sort of been this charming story. Well, charming might be a little bit of he's a bit rough around the edges. So I think charming might be the wrong word, but he has been this kind of this fun symbol for Vanderbilt.
America loves Tim Riggins. I don't know what you're talking about.
So, but his rise, to kind of the forefront, and obviously some people had seen him at New Mexico State. Obviously Auburn certainly remembers him at New Mexico State. To see him there, and as well as obviously, it used to be you could always just poach the coaches. That's nothing new. A lot of coaches, obviously they took Tim Beck from New Mexico State as the offensive coordinator. Heck, Jerry Kill is on the staff of Vanderbilt now to go along with it. But not only that, but you can bring in a key player or two and really change the dynamics of it. And it's only been underlined because the moment anybody has tried to challenge the ability of players to transfer, it gets pulled into a court, and courts kind of go like, yeah, no, this is not right. You have to allow players to be able to move around. That has been both. And I mean, it's interesting because you'll hear the conversations that go on both in sports media and among fans and, in various forums or websites or whatever. And there's a push and pull here. There was this big push, like, the players are getting hosed in this deal. They're not getting the opportunities they deserve. The coaches can leave, but players have to sit out a year, or they have to move down a level if they want to play immediately. And it always seemed kind of nonsensical in a lot of ways. But now that they can do that, suddenly you get but not that way, if it affects my team. And I think that's the problem too. You get fans who kind of get confused with, it's a fan. You're usually a fan of your team more than the players, because there is a certain level, even though we're getting to the point where the joke is, will they be able to be college football players forever? They are, though, more transient. Even in the old ways, you get maybe 3 good years out of a player before they would have to move on, and probably go on to the NFL. Meanwhile, the team is always there. So there is that push and pull. Like, you care about the players, you want them to be able to move, and yet here they are. But that same ability to move is being used in ways, because I mean, that was the big bad. The big fear was the transfer portal was going, and NIL was going to allow a team like an Alabama or a Georgia just to stack up with talent. It was going to be like the old days before scholarship limits or roster limits, where you could just have everybody in the state of Alabama on the Crimson Tide, on the Crimson Tide roster. But instead, we're starting to see we're seeing savvy work here by coaches. And part of that conversation we've heard is, maybe teams need more general managers, and we're starting to see that role grow. But some of these savvier teams like Vanderbilt, like, a couple of the other programs we've seen that where you look at that roster that pulled an upset and you're like, wait, this is actually an interesting patchwork. I mean, Indiana, they were the first team to reach bowl eligibility this year on the back of a bunch of players that came with their coach from James Madison and a quarterback from Ohio, who I'm sure several other teams right now that are having a little bit of, buyer's remorse from their portal hires or portal selections. I'm not going to say hires. We're not inducing them to pay for play yet, but they're looking at that and they're thinking, man, we could have made a better call on this play. So I think the portal, especially in NIL, has made a big factor in it. And I'm happy to say, I'm not going to say with complete confidence, that it has been a big factor in why we're seeing a lot more teams compete. Not every team, and we knew that wasn't going to be the case. Not every team can be competitive every year, but the teams that are suddenly competitive, like in Indiana, we're looking at who's on that roster and we're like, yeah, they made some good picks and people are meshing. And while it might not work for every team, and we're now obviously talking about Ole Miss and whether or not they're getting exactly what they needed out of the transfer haul that the so-called portal king can bring in there, sometimes, yeah, it can actually work out. And for those teams, for that sweet spot, I mean, if you're in Alabama, you want to see success year after year. But Indiana, if you have a year like this, holy cow, the Hoosier fans, the Hoosier faithful are hyped for this.
Well, I think that I agree. So my number one reason that I wanted to talk about was the transfer portal. And there's a couple pieces to it, right? Because like you mentioned, there's this idea that, these top level teams can just take players. Boise State managed to hang on to Ashton Jeanty, right? Last year, Toledo managed to hang on to Quinyon Mitchell. So, I do think that this idea that just every single good player is going to leave has been a little overstated. The other piece of this too, though, and I think maybe in some cases the more important factor, is the amount of players who are leaving these top programs. So, for example, let me bring up Georgia. So this past year, they lost 24 players to the transfer portal. Now, none of them were all that important, right? None of them really were supposed to be major contributors, but 20 of them did end up at other Power 5 schools, Power 4 schools, I guess now, which is a huge number. And here's the issue. These are players who would have either competed for starting jobs or been key backups in a way that would have let Georgia just have way more talent than everybody else. And they add a player like Dominic Lovett through the transfer portal. They add a player like London Humphreys through the transfer portal. But for every one of those, you're losing two former 4 or 5-star players in the portal. And so I think that the level of unbeatable depth that teams used to have at that top level, it's diminishing just a little bit. Now, look, Georgia has way more talent than almost everybody else, but there's levels to this, right? I mean, 2020 Alabama not only had more talent than everybody else, they had way more talent than everybody else in a way that nobody else could touch. The other piece of this is that, especially in a quick transfer era, I think that it means that players are much less likely to sit and develop than they used to. And that was the thing about the Saban era at Alabama is players would come in as the best players in high school and then they'd sit for 3 years and not play any meaningful snaps. And then year 4, they'd be Jonathan Allen, right? Like they'd be Damian Harris. They'd be this incredible player who spent 3 years growing in their strength program as a backup. And that guy just might not be willing to do that anymore. They might decide, I mean, Bear Alexander a couple of years ago, he's just like, well, I'm going to go to USC because I want to play right away. And he might have had a chance to start at Georgia, but he didn't want to compete for that. He decided that he wanted to go. And also maybe history's going to repeat itself again, but that's a whole other conversation.
I was about to say, and then Bear Alexander might also feel like, I'm not getting enough reps at USC.
I want to play where I can get lots of, anyway. But I think that we see this in college basketball. Actually, this is a weird comparison, but I think it's apt. Teams that manage to stick together and grow together and play together and get older are the teams that pull upsets in March Madness. If you want to find a team that's going to pull March Madness upsets, look for the team that brought back everybody from the season before, hit a bunch of threes, and they might not be the most physically talented, but like, unfortunately, as a Baylor graduate, I got to see Clemson pull that garbage last year against a really, really good Baylor team, right? So, like, this is kind of happening in some ways in college football. Not exactly the same because you do just see more movement in general. And so it's like, and there's a number of players that you need to have, right? But I'd even give for an example at Vanderbilt. It's not that every single player on the roster has played together, but Vanderbilt brought in a consortium of guys from New Mexico State, a head coach in Jerry Kill, who's now a major consultant there, an offensive coordinator in Tim Beck, a quarterback in Diego Pavia, and a tight end in Eli Stowers, all of whom were part of that program last year. And those guys were the key pieces who were able to come together to beat Alabama. So I do think that for all the talk of what the big programs will be able to add and what holes they'll be able to fill, I think that it's actually like the players who are being affected are not the top 22 for Alabama, but it's 31 through 43 are suddenly not a part of the program anymore. And you're trying to backfill with guys from programs that you wouldn't have recruited originally in many cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people forget that when you recruit at a school like Georgia or Alabama, you're bringing in a lot of top recruits and they all can't possibly play at once. And that impatience does play a little bit into it. And if you're a team pulling a guy that, first of all, they may even have a bit of a chip on their shoulder because they thought they were, the king of the universe, especially if you're in high school and you're being recruited by, one of these top elite schools, you're going to go to another school and probably try pretty hard. I mean, let's look at Pitt, Eli Holstein. He is an Alabama quarterback who is now, by the way, I still think Holstein would have fit better at Wisconsin. Just the name, the cow thing. I'm sorry. I just had it in America's Dairyland. Holstein is a better fit, but Pitt, good job by getting it. But I'm saying that aside, the other thing too is I was thinking about what you said, and I absolutely agree about the veteran squads that are stuck together. I'm like, did you just make a case for why the team most likely to commit an upset in the college football playoff will be an Army or a Navy team? because they've all played together. It's not like you're getting any
and they're
transfers
taking
in or out.
advantage of that, right? They're
Yeah.
absolutely taking advantage of that.
But another thing, and this is something that took place today, earlier today, we're recording this here on the 9th, was that the NCAA is officially doing away with the National Letter of Intent. So I thought that was kind of it, because it used to be that the NLI was like that moment, the big ceremony of who they were going to sign with was, oh man, that player is now completely off the board. And it has lessened it somewhat. I mean, we've talked about that a little bit. The big signing day announcements, I mean, they're nice, but and sometimes you get a guy like a Jeremiah Smith, obviously, who's just great out of the box, who's doing a tremendous job at Ohio State. But a lot of these guys, they go there, and as you said, they kind of go through the system. And then maybe if they work out, in 3 years, you'll see them on the field, at least in a significant role. But it has sort of diminished that to the point where, I wasn't a huge fan of recruiting just in general. I always thought it was a little bit overblown, especially because
I'm still not.
You see the flops. I mean, especially when I was just more of a pure, like, I'm a USC guy, like I was watching that. You see so many of these guys go through and you're like, oh wow, Whitney Lewis, you were ranked higher than Reggie Bush and no one ever saw you again, and you ended your career at Northern Iowa. So sometimes you just see these guys go through and you kind of get a little burned. Now, instead, we're seeing opportunities for some of these guys who may not immediately make it to move away, and smart coaches taking advantage of it. And, frankly, another aspect of this, I'm not sure yet, but how much of this is also just Nick Saban really was not just, I mean, generational coach is the wrong word. I mean, he was truly the greatest of all time. And it took me a while to win over to that side of the perspective of it. And his ability to keep guys in, to get guys willing to buy into. The moment he left, we saw, and I'm not saying that's what cost, Alabama the game against Vandy, but we certainly saw a bunch of people start to leave that surprised everyone. I mean, Caleb Downs being the top of that particular the pecking order. So I think the fact is Saban just had a certain ability that no other coach has been able to match. Maybe Kirby Smart to some extent, but we've certainly seen, as you pointed out, a number of people leave Georgia. That it was not quite the same as it has been in Alabama. So are we seeing a shift away from the elites? Because we've talked about it before, but that was a complaint for a lot of, I think, just, I don't want to say casual, but a lot of just regular college football fans who weren't fans of the handful of programs that seemed to be making it into the final each year. If you weren't a Clemson, Alabama, Georgia, maybe Ohio State fan, it felt there was a lot of buzz of just like, what's the point of this anymore? We're seeing the elites rise up. But the combination of that portal and NIL, and now the departure of some of these head coaches, and you're just saying, Harbaugh managed to keep his team together. Well, hey, he's no longer here either. So it's unclear if, and that's been one of the factors I was thinking of, is part of this parity just the fact that all of these factors, and also just a couple of key guys leaving the profession, suddenly it does feel a lot more open. And there's more opportunities out there than this domineering force that was presented by a handful of these coaches.
Well, and I think that people have said before, in like kind of a joking way, that Nick Saban broke college football, but he kind of did. We're not used to teams being that good every single year for that long a period of time. We even talked about it after Kirby Smart won his second title, right? Like, will they be able to keep up this level? Because Nick Saban did. And last year in 2023, they didn't. They weren't able to replace some of the key pieces that they lost from the 2022 team. Now, Georgia, I think, still was probably national title good in 2023, but also even in 2022, it's not like they were tremendously dominant, right? Like they should have lost arguably to Ohio State in the college football playoffs. So like, I do think that we got so used to the idea between 2008 and 2020 that Nick Saban just had a roster that nobody else could match. And I think one other thing too, in the way that we think about college football, is we would be like, well, yeah, they lost, but like, obviously they're the best team. Like, obviously, Alabama's the best team. It doesn't matter if they lost. Like, oh, yeah, the team beat them in 2014 or whatever. Yeah, but like they're the best team, right? Like, we know that they're the best team. And I think that we've taken that thinking and translated it to teams that have not earned that right. And that's not a knock at of Georgia. That's not a knock of Ohio State. But like they haven't earned that right to be treated as unbeatable, as no one else has a chance. That Tennessee, they haven't earned that right. And really, the only person who's earned that right is Nick Saban in Alabama, and even his Alabama teams between 2021 and 2023, they started to lose that right, which also, again, coincided with the transfer portal and NIL and some of these dynamics that we talk about. So I think that we need to reframe all of college football as, again, there will be teams in individual years that potentially earn that right. Again, Texas or Ohio State this year, they may earn that right to say, hey, these are the best teams in college football no matter what happens over the next couple of weeks. But like Texas, the program, Ohio State, the program, Georgia, the program, whichever other program, Oregon, for example, like they got a lot of work to do to get the level of credibility that I think that we've ascribed to Alabama in the Nick Saban era. And it also just might not be something that exists anymore.
Yeah, one of the things I've been trying to also sort of frame this is how I'm not saying how could the genie go back in the bottle because I frankly don't even want to see that happen, but I don't think it can be done. But what could happen to maybe sort of at least steer things a little bit back to how things were? I'm not saying intentionally, but through just the bigger kind of macro issues that are currently occurring in college football right now, mostly around the House settlement, only because they're talking about obviously revenue sharing and that aspect of it. I'm not sure that will make a huge impact on how things are operating now. However, it is one more step towards, I think, an inevitability of the players being ruled as employees. I mean, short of with just a quick summary for those who haven't been keeping up with that, short of the US Congress passing a law saying that, college athletes can't be employees, it's probably going to happen because that's why you see all of the lobbying for it. That's why even the House settlement has these weird comments that apparently like everyone's going to kumbaya and lobby Congress together because if we get a judge that says they're employees, it seems like we're going to then see the next logical step, which would be a collective bargaining agreement for all the players, kind of like what we see in the pro sports world. And then that would be something that could at least, and again, this is based on the things the judges have said in all the various cases that have gone against the NCAA, that would be something that they would probably tolerate and say like, okay, that's okay. Mostly because there is already a system out there and it's proven to work in the pro sports era. If we pro sports world, if we see that at the college level, I could see then suddenly we have a little bit more firm rules and how those rules set up could potentially benefit more of the haves rather than the have-nots. But even then, I mean, to be clear, I'm talking about Vandy. They're still a member of the SEC. I mean, they're still going to be one of the haves, maybe not one of the biggest haves, but they're still getting a piece of a much larger pie right now. And, while NIU's upset was neat and everything, we have seen those before. I mean, App State, Michigan, 2007, one of those great moments in college football upsets. I mean, they were still an FCS team. There are still those moments out there.
That was 17 years ago, just to be clear.
Well, Idaho nearly knocked off Oregon for a while there, so you never know. I mean, so these things do happen, and they're crazy and they're wild. So I part of me wonders, are those just the mixing the blips versus the larger trends? But I do wonder what influence that will have, and if we reach that point. But certainly for now, the parity has become something that I'm pretty sure most college football fans are welcoming. And this 12-team playoff in particular is going to make that feel even greater, especially when we get to this 12-team playoff. I'm not sure which teams are going to. We're starting to get suspicions, but we know there's a handful of teams that are going to seem pretty dominant when they get there. They're probably going to be a couple of undefeateds. People are going to be like, we're going to probably crown one of those two teams, just like you get to not with undefeateds, but certainly with the March Madness, you get a couple of basketball teams are probably, there's a reason they were the one seeds heading into the regionals. Now, in this particular era, our 12-team playoff, I would love to see a couple of upsets. I would love to see one of those teams just get upset. I'm not sure which one, but I want to see one of these teams that people thought was going to be one of the three likely candidates, or maybe four likely candidates to reach the semis, get an upset, just so that we can see that kind of chaos, because that will also create a different mentality, I think, even among players and recruits, to just realize that, you don't have to go to those handful of teams. You could be a team that was perhaps a lower ranked team that could make it all the way, and how that will also start to kind of work its way into the mind of not only the fans, but also the press, and all of that influences a lot of the rest of college football and what can happen and what can truly, because I mean, we've talked about that before, like the previous week, with the Georgia Alabama game, people were like, is it meaningless? And people are like, no, it means just as much. I'm like, well, part of it, to me, I'm hesitant to say, no, look at this. The 12 team playoff had no effect. I think people are still operating in the mind that this is the first year. So we're still thinking like it's a 14 playoff era. But I think over time, if we see more of those kinds of upsets in the playoff, that could really, really make an impact on how people perceive other teams. And that perception will manifest itself in even more parity, as weird as it is to say, because people will realize that you don't have to go to certain teams. You could be on other programs and make it.
Well, and I think another piece of this, right, is let's just say, just for hypothetical sake, let's say that Texas and Ohio State lose relatively early, right? Like, let's just say the reality is, like, nobody else in the field has looked anywhere near unbeatable to this point, right? It really would be anyone's game. And also, by the way, Texas and Ohio State still have plenty of opportunity to drop games in the regular season before we even get to that point. So, I mean, again, those are the two teams that I think have the best possibility of being above everybody else. But there's no guarantee. There's no lock, certainly. I mean, Ohio State could lose this week. Texas could lose this week. They play Oklahoma. They play Oregon. One other dynamic, though, that I did want to talk about real quick, and it's one that I've been tracking. I really want to try to write on it at some point, but I'm trying to figure out how to write on it. I feel like even among the top programs, people have lost the plot when it comes to offensive line play. And I think that teams are way too confident that they can add transfers that are going to be contributors. And when you look at the most disappointing teams in the country this season, it's a who's who of teams that thought that they could build an offensive line through the portal. Oklahoma, of course, being really high on the list. Missouri being a team that's high on the list. I mean, I think even SMU to an extent, especially with their slow start, was because of issues in offensive line development. Like, you just can't really do it. I think that, maybe you can bring in a guy to fill a hole, if you need a left guard, go grab a left guard. But if you are trying to put a guy who has not been a part of your development program in at 4 spots, it's not going to work. It has not worked. And I think that, again, this is like sort of the curse in some ways of this like new era where you expect to be competitive every single year. You could look at some of these teams and be like, well, look, I mean, here's the reality is that this team probably isn't all that good on the offensive line. They're rebuilding in a lot of ways, and maybe it's okay for this to be a rebuilding year. But we kind of ended up in another situation where it's like, no, well, we got to find all these seniors to play over all of our underclassmen. And by the way, when those seniors graduate after playing badly, you got a bunch of underclassmen who then won't have played either. And you're gonna be like, well, we got to find more transfers to fill in these spots, and then the underclassmen leave. Like, it's just a hamster wheel that I think that teams have gotten themselves on that I think is going to get them in real trouble, not just short term, but long term. I mean, the reality is when you look at the best teams in the country right now, they are primarily teams that have been built through high school recruiting on the offensive line. The number one program for that is Texas. Texas took their lumps early with some of the players on their roster, but they've come through. And ultimately, they've become a really good unit. And I mean, honestly, maybe one of the best offensive line groups in the country. I think that when you look at Ole Miss, I mean, Ole Miss brought in some transfers to try to fill some holes. And I think when you look at their struggles against Kentucky, that's a huge part of it, is that they really relied on some transfers to come in and fix some things for them. So it's, again, I need to try to figure out a good way to actually evaluate and write about this in a way that's like statistically significant, I guess you could say. But I mean, the reality is, like, I think that teams that are constantly shuffling their offensive lines, that are constantly bringing in new guys, who constantly expect to be saved by players who might not be ready. Those are the teams that I probably heading forward will fade a little more than other people.
One team that has kind of faded into the background, but I think is potentially going to work its way into the forefront, that is on this specific topic, is playing this week against Kansas State, and that is Colorado, because that was a whole big question in the offseason, trying to rebuild, depending on how you frame it, but just trying to rebuild an offensive line, or is also, Coach Sanders trying to build an offensive line for his son to be protected a little bit better. But, looking at where Colorado is now, I know people miss it because at first he was being critical. And recently, Shador actually complimented his offensive line. So if they can get that going, I do wonder what we're going to think of in this. But of course, it started out weak. Regardless of how they do towards the end, you don't just slap an offensive line together and just hope it worked, as you pointed out. But it's just interesting, too. That made me think of that because it's remarkable how little people have been talking about Colorado, yet they're 4-1. But I think that might make a good transition when we get back to this.
This is just real quick. This is the week that we figure out whether Colorado is actually going to be relevant in this conversation, because they play Kansas State, and that's a team that's going to stress test your offensive line.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, when we get back from the break, we're going to take a quick look at several of the games coming up this week. Not necessarily Colorado, Kansas State, although we will probably talk about it on our following episode. But yeah, so when we come back here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about this week, because unlike last week's boring slate, this week we actually have a couple of games that on their face seem like they're going to be quite interesting, and maybe they'll all be disappointing, maybe they'll all be exciting. I'm pretty sure we've got some real bangers going on here. So we're trying to kind of narrow it down. We're going to try and figure out a big question for each of, well, we've selected 5 big games to discuss. I mean, there's more than that, but 5 focus games. I mean, now, Sean, I know you're going to kick us off with the big game going on in the Texas Fairgrounds. What do we got to look for there?
Yeah, my big question for this game, and actually I'm going to write about it a little bit more over at cbssports.com tomorrow, so make sure and check that out. Is Texas going to look like a national championship contender in a game that's known for chaos? Because here's the reality. Back in 2005, this game actually reminds me a lot of that one. Back in 2005, when, of course, Texas goes on to win the national championship. Sorry I had to remind you of that team, Bobak. But they played Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was not very good. They were 2-2 coming into the matchup. They did end up winning 8 games, but not a great Oklahoma team, of course. But they had won 5 straight games against Texas in the Cotton Bowl. And Texas came in as 2 touchdown favorites, just like they are on Saturday. But nobody felt comfortable about that game, right? Nobody felt like Texas was going to bulldoze that game because it's Red River. It's never like that. It's always a competitive game, unless Davis Bevell is playing quarterback, but that's a whole other conversation. But Texas came out in 2005 and won by 3 touchdowns against a good Bob Stoops team. They looked like a national championship contender. They left no doubt leaving the field that they were head and shoulders better than this team. And this Oklahoma team is a lot worse than the one that came into the stadium in 2005. And I mean, look, 2005 Texas is one of the greatest teams of all time. I'm not saying that this Texas team has to be that good, but they need to leave no doubt. So again, my guiding question is, will Texas look like the national championship contender that they are? Because if they come in and flatten Oklahoma, then I think that we can say, okay, they are 1,000% on the title tier.
I wonder what happened to that coach. He was a good coach, Mac Brown. It's a shame that he hasn't been able.
People forget that when Texas played against Oklahoma in 1984, which was the last time that Texas came into this game ranked number 1 in the country, people forget Mac Brown was coaching in that game as an Oklahoma assistant.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Was that for Switzer?
A great fun fact.
Yeah.
I think that would have been Switzer, 1984. It's right on that borderline. I'll look it up.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because I just saw there was a feature of Switzer today. I mean, he's still kicking.
Yes.
I still, for those, by the way, this is just a total aside. I'm mad because they were taken off YouTube by Dunkin' Donuts. But Dunkin' Donuts once hired Switzer for the strangest commercials I have ever seen. They're hilarious, and they were only on YouTube. I never saw them on TV. But the whole idea was him like coaching people in totally random areas, like with a great line, getting Barry Switzer to deliver a line that's Kant has no place in women's lacrosse, gentlemen. Like he delivered it with such gravitas that I will forever love Barry Switzer because he did those commercials that like only 5 people saw. Anywho,
Yes, by the way, so Barry Switzer was the head coach. Mac Brown spent 1 year as Oklahoma's offensive coordinator. The game ended in a 15-15 tie.
oh,
But also, it's crazy. So Mac, obviously, between 2013 and 2019, he was not coaching anything, right? But otherwise, he has been a head coach continuously from 1983 till present day. That is nuts. That's too many years as a head coach, man. I don't know. I go on vacation. I don't know what you're doing.
yeah, or run a company or something. I mean, he's got that
do something
mentality.
else. Just
And
do
he's
something else.
a nice guy. I'll say that.
Oh,
Yeah, again, he's got
great.
that certain
He's great.
that there's that natural charisma he has that is unreal. I still
There-
remember.
There's a
getting
reason
chance-
that he worked at the University of Texas, and it's because that man is a hell of a politician. He's
Oh, yeah.
he's one of the ones who I definitely would most like to meet down the road. I haven't gotten a chance to as yet.
Yeah, absolutely. You could see how he can be. I mean, because also being a head coach is a salesman job as well, trying to sell the boosters. That's a guy who has that kind of charisma. He can do that. Absolutely. He can loosen pockets. He can get those donations. So the next one we're going to look at, Ohio State 5-0, heading to number 2 in the country, heading to number 3 in the country. Oregon 5-0. It's a battle for bowl eligibility. No, it is funny to think that Indiana's already bowl eligible, and these two teams are still technically fighting to be bowl eligible.
You'll get there someday, y'all.
You'll get there someday. One of you guys will take at least 2 games, but one of you will get there this weekend. But it's interesting. One thing that struck me in trying to frame this particular game, last night I do a call-in show and I talked to an Oregon fan, and I've seen Oregon fans just everywhere. They're all way more worried about their team than they normally are because historically, especially in the Pac-12, Oregon fans are known for an insane amount of, a healthy amount of confidence in the Ducks, just blowing everybody out. They were always the nouveau riche of the Pac-12 in a lot of ways. And I mean, that's great. The confidence, the success, they certainly have earned it. But a lot of their concerns tend to be about Dylan Gabriel, who has obviously a transfer quarterback originally at UCF, but obviously at Oklahoma previously, completing a lot of passes. I think he leads the country in pass completions, like 79%, but also red zone turnovers, not a lot of yards after catch in those passes. A lot of concerns over that. But to me, I was trying to figure out the way I would rather frame this game is whether or not the defensive line of Oregon can do anything to disrupt Ohio State. Because Ohio State, the Iowa game last week was at least somewhat of a team with a pulse. We've talked about that. They didn't start out particularly fast, but they eventually did, dominate and win by the end of that game. But I'm curious to see the defensive line of Oregon, if they can put enough pressure. And it's interesting, too. It's almost like a pick your poison because we know that, that offensive, the running game of Ohio State, we knew it was going to be good. You've got 2 great backs in Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins. I mean, I think at this point, they're the number 5 rushing offense in the land. We knew we were going to expect a lot with Chip Kelly, especially as their offensive coordinator now. But I think really then the choice here, ideally for Oregon, is can they corral that enough to put pressure on Will Howard to throw? And that's knowing that you have Jeremiah Smith back there as well as everyone else on that excellent roster. That's knowing that, they've only been able to put 4 sacks on Ohio State all season long. I think that's the 11th fewest right now in college football. So I'm curious to see. I know Oregon brought in some good edge rushers. They've also got Jordan Bursch. They've got good guys on the line, with Jamari Caldwell, Derek Harmon. Ohio State's had some weakness in the tackle position with Josh Simmons and Josh Fryer, who aren't bad, but I mean, that has been one of the positions of opportunity. And I'm sure you got someone like Dan Lanning and company who are salivating at the opportunity to perhaps target those areas. But that to me is going to be the big question. I mean, can the strength of that line, obviously you've got Seth McLaughlin, Donovan Jackson that are part of that line. Can they do enough to create protection for to allow the running game to be established and then, loosen it up, because that'll give Howard more opportunities to mix it up with a running game. So I think I'm curious to see how, because again, yes, Oregon's defensive numbers on the season aren't great, but that's because they had to face a guy who has turned out to be an absolute phenomenon in G5, and that was Ashton Jeanty, who put up 192 yards against the Ducks. He has against everybody. He's put up yards whenever he's on the field. But beyond that, though, Oregon's looked pretty promising. I mean, I know they were able to hold UCLA and Michigan State to under 60 yards on the ground, so they can do it. But of course, talking about that two-headed back they have at Ohio State, I think they're a little closer to Jeanty than they are to the running game at UCLA or Michigan State. But I'm curious to see. That to me is where this game is going to come down to. My questions are, can Ohio State or can Oregon? I mean, I think part of the thing is this. Maybe because we have the number 2 and number 3 team. The number 3 team here gives me the bigger questions. Number 2 team, we know it's a good roster. We know they're going to probably perform well. And that is a question. Is a bigger question. Do I want to see Ohio State prove itself, or do I want to see Oregon State show that it's worthy of the number 3 rank, and not just because so many people lost that they've kind of started at number 3, fell all the way to number 9, and rose back up to number 3 just based on the games going on around them, and not really because they had necessarily earned it.
No, I think it's a great way to think of it. I'll look even at that Oregon State game. Like, Oregon State averaged more than 4 yards per carry against this Oregon defense, right? It hasn't necessarily been a consistently successful Oregon defense and defensive front, especially. And while Idaho didn't run the ball well, they were able to do quite a bit in the short game because of the way that they were able to just keep the ball moving. So I do think that this is a huge question mark for this Oregon team, because if you can attack Ohio State anywhere, it is that offensive line, which they did what I said that you should do. They added one key transfer in Seth McLaughlin, who's been playing pretty well. They didn't try to revamp everything, but it was a relatively less experienced offensive line coming into the year. I don't know that there's an obvious weakness anywhere else on this team. So I do think that you're going to have to be disruptive, potentially create some mistakes for Ohio State. And yeah, I mean, the times that Ohio State has been the most inconsistent, it's been the times that they've gone away from running the ball, specifically with their running backs. I actually harped on this in their last game, that after rolling down the field against Iowa, evenly split between 7 carries from their running backs, 6 passes and a run from their quarterback, they essentially abandoned the running back for the entire rest of the first half and didn't score again. I do think that if Oregon's able to take that away, it really opens up some opportunities.
Absolutely. So moving over to another game, this one going into the Big 12, which again, the Big 12 has been delightful because there's so many games you could pick there. But I like the one you've selected. You've got Arizona going into the team that has been the surprise, one of the biggest surprises this season. And maybe that kind of goes into the whole parity question. I'm not quite sure. But number 14, BYU, 5-0. What are we thinking about that game?
Yeah, it's a great game, and for so many reasons. Obviously, Arizona's been disappointing, but we know what they can do well. Especially, I mean, they have a great passing game. They've got one of the best receivers in the entire country in Tetairoa McMillan. They've got a quarterback in Noah Fafita who has stepped up to the moment on many occasions. And BYU defensively has just been absolutely suffocating. You look, outside of that Baylor game where Baylor scored a lot in garbage time, but never really had a chance to win that game. BYU hasn't allowed more than 15 points this season to any other opponent to this point. They've been dominant. They've been suffocating. They've been really good at every level. The hire of Jay Hill as their defensive coordinator last year has paid a lot of dividends. And Arizona is going to be a team that challenges them in so many ways. So I think the question for me heading into this game is, what is BYU able to generate offensively? Because they have depended so much on, I don't want to make the comparison all the way to Iowa, but like they have been a team that's been field position, getting stops, being in good positions, getting stops in the red zone, and kind of just forcing Jake Retzlaff to do a little bit of everything offensively. I want to see another playmaker for them step up. Chase Roberts has been that guy at receiver a little bit for them, but they've really been injured at running back. Their top rusher right now is their quarterback, Jake Retzlaff. So I want to see against an Arizona defense that's pretty salty, especially in the secondary. Is there another playmaker that BYU has the ability to lean on offensively outside of Jake Retzlaff? Because if the answer is yes, then like it's smooth sailing until you get to the Utah game, which is obviously going to be a tremendous one on November 9th. And really, I mean, even you look at the rest of the schedule, like the Utah game is the only game where they won't definitely be favored. So a big opportunity here, I think. We know what this BYU defense is. I want to see what this BYU offense is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. One thing, and people may not remember this, but Jay Hill is actually a slightly before it became more well-known. He was a strong FCS coach at Weber State, consistently getting him to the playoff. They were a top 10 team when he was taken and hired away to be the defensive coordinator at BYU, which, we've seen that more now in the G5. But again, it's one of these moments, like to me, the other great example of that was Jeremy Chadwell being hired away from Charleston Southern to be the offensive coordinator, and then heir apparent at Coastal, and now obviously at Liberty. But that was one of those big hires. Actually, as crazy as it is, I knew a Weber State football fan, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, BYU just poached our head coach away," and boy, did that pay off. And we're seeing it now in year 2 of that defense that they've got there for the Cougs. It is a fascinating game, and I mean, Arizona, again, they were able to knock off Utah at Utah. So are they going to be the bane of the Beehive State if they also go and knock off BYU? I'm very curious to see where this is going to go, because then that's going to set up another interesting game the following week, depending on who wins that Colorado Kansas State tilt. I mean, again, thank you, Big 12, for being pure entertainment. The next game we wanted to talk about is going to be happening in the Coliseum in Los Angeles. An unranked USC team, 3-2, 1-2 in conference, but honestly, one of the more confusing, and still not entirely sure if they are they good, or are they just having bad luck. They're hosting a Penn State team that is undefeated and quietly just kind of getting enough done, looking good. Number 4 in the land. I think part of the problem is they've always been and also ran in the Big Ten to the dominant teams, the Ohio States and the Michigans. That the question is, are they going to be again? Except this year's version is going to be the Ohio States again and the Oregons. But looking at this game, I think this is going to be another one where it's going to be make or break it on the USC offensive line. I'm going to just say it's weird to say this because USC's big question going into the season was obviously defense. I think at this point, 5 games into the season, as crazy as it sounds, the defense isn't the real problem at USC right now. They're doing just enough. They've improved from 100 and something to like 30 something. Even against Minnesota, I was covering that game. It looked like they could do just enough. In fact, there were serious questions. The more I've heard about it, seeing it in the stadium versus hearing the discussions afterwards, did they stop, Minnesota, to stop that final touchdown? I'm not sure. But all of that is to say, the real problem is actually the offensive line, which is something we knew was theoretically going to be a problem. And yet it's only a partial issue. They're able to make running lanes for Woody Marks to get out there, but their pass protection has been lousy. And that pass protection has put Miller Moss in a position where, against Minnesota, the longest pass he had was 18 yards, threw a couple of picks. The last one was a desperation throw, but it's made that offense kind of less potent, despite the fact that they're able to establish a ground game. So all of that said, Tom Allen, the defensive coordinator of Penn State, is going to have a real opportunity here to send defenders all over that line. And whether that line can pick them up is a big question. You've got, obviously, Abdul Carter, their great defensive end. He's got, at this point, 8 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 2 QB hurries, and a forced fumble. They're probably going to put 2 guys on Carter, so that'll open up the other guy, Danny Dennis Sutton. So, again, he's also got plenty of hurries and pass breakups. And, again, that says nothing about, they've got a tackle with Zane Durant. They've got linebackers like Kobe King and Tony Rojas that are going to probably try to also help slow down that running game. Ultimately, Penn State, I think their offense is going to generate enough points. That's what they've done. Drew Aller, I mean, we were kind of joking about it before the season. Is he going to be really a phenomenon? I mean, he's doing good. He's doing fine. Really, it's still who we thought it was going to be, Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton. And while, again, Penn State didn't have the greatest running game against UCLA, it's because Singleton was out for that game. They're both probably going to be back for the USC game. So, Penn State's going to put up points. My question is, can that offensive line give Miller Moss an opportunity to throw passes? Because at this point, I mean, we've seen how they perform now against three blue blood's the wrong word, but three old school, Big Ten teams with Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Penn State's going to be more so on all versions of that. Can they adjust, and especially at home? I know, and personally, I'm just going to say, I think this season a little bit too much has been made about travel. I think a lot of reporters have been going into this wanting to look for losses. I mean, I keep hearing like only one team has crossed time zones to win. I'm like, okay, Stanford won at Syracuse, Miami won at Cal. Who's doing the counting here? Like it's one of these things where one guy tweets it and then like everyone runs with it and you hear it on the shows.
It was a specific Big Ten stat, to be clear. That was the one that was tweeted out. Yes.
But I'm just saying, I think that's being a little overplayed. All of that said, if Penn State manages to lose here, okay, then you won me over. But I'm very curious to see.
We decided college football playoff spots because of body clocks. Like it's already baked into college football lore that we're going to take into account time zones.
Okay, we'll see how this goes on that. But I again, all of that said, though, I think this one is going to boil down to, can that USC offensive line get anything protection? If they can't, first of all, you can just go ahead and write off USC for the rest of the season, because that's going to be, everyone's going to now know how to break them, especially in the Big Ten. But as for Penn State, at least now we're going to get a chance to really to be fair, again, Penn State got a test already. That Illinois team has proven to be quite a program. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to be a playoff team, but they've proven to be quite a challenger. But here we do see an opportunity to get a sense of where Penn State stands. But I'm more curious to see about where USC is after this one.
Wait, I have a quick question because I didn't get to watch all of this game live. Why did Minnesota not just kick a field goal at the 1 yard line?
PJ Fleck hit on this, and I think he was right. And I had a chance to listen to both of those press conferences because I thought, again, I love when you listen to press conferences, and even though there were side distractions of how Lincoln Riley had answered another question, both of them I thought were dead right about what their decisions were made and why they made them. Because PJ Fleck straight up said, I knew that if we kicked a field goal, they would probably be able to march down the field and get in a field goal range. And they did. They literally did. The only reason why the game lost is because Miller Moss had to try and throw a touchdown, and he managed to throw a pick, but into the end zone. So, I mean, they were in that range. And, hearing on the other side, for example, Lincoln Riley's like, we had 3 turnovers all on their side of the field, and I have a kicker who can make kicks. That was points lost. So those two, I thought, kind of went into that, and they both knew what could happen in that circumstance. Because certainly, even though, and you get that, because even though Fleck's defense had, as I said, really done a good job of controlling the deep passing ability of Miller Moss and kind of putting him on his back a lot in that game, they knew that that's still a guy who can just march the team down the field in a hurry if they need to. So that was the reason why they decided to go for it there.
All right, well, little crazy to me, but hey, you know what? It worked. So you look like a genius when things work. Anyway, let's move on to our last game that we're going to touch on. And this is, to me, this is an irrelevance bowl. Whoever loses this game, we're not even going to acknowledge exists for the rest of the year. And that would be LSU versus Ole Miss. I'm mostly saying this because I think LSU is going to lose, and I have no interest in talking about them for the rest of the year because I think that they might just be kind of bad. But all that said, the big guiding question for me here is it has to do with Ole Miss. And for me, it's against real competition, especially, to some extent on defense. Obviously, LSU's defense still not all that good. But should we be worried about this Ole Miss running game against real competition? Was it just a Kentucky thing? Is Kentucky just... And Kentucky's a really good defense, and especially a really good rush defense. But I'm a little concerned about the fact that they have not been all that efficient in SEC play when it comes to running the ball. Of course, in that Kentucky game, they go 29 for 92 with a touchdown. That's fine, but I think that a lot of their issues sustaining drives come back to the fact that they weren't running the ball all that consistently or efficiently. You look at that South Carolina game, 27-3 is the final, and like they get 140 yards on the ground, but it's on 41 carries, so like 3.5 less than 4 yards per carry. That's not really doing a whole lot for me as well. And there are going to be teams that cause their offensive line and their run blocking a whole lot more issues. I don't know if LSU is that, but if they don't look good running the ball in this game of all games, then I think that we kind of just have to say that Ole Miss doesn't have it. Because you can have all the great, defensive linemen transfer in. You can be really good on defense. You can have a great quarterback. You can have Trey Harris at receiver. But like, if you can't run the ball in the SEC, you're not a contender. That's just the reality of the situation. So this is a big one for Ole Miss. They have to go on the road. It's at LSU. That's always tough to go and play in Death Valley. But I mean, Ole Miss should win this game, and they need to run the ball at a higher level. Because if they lose this game, they play Oklahoma, who has a way better defensive front than LSU. They play Georgia still, and then you still have the Egg Bowl. So if you lose this game, I think that you're kind of not really a playoff contender in any meaningful way.
This is the shunning game. Whoever loses this, we're going to shun you. We're not even going to acknowledge your existence. LSU, or Ole Miss. I don't know. Ole Missing. I'm not sure.
And LSU, by the way, who still has at Texas A&M versus Alabama and then versus Oklahoma in the coming weeks.
Oh, this is Vandy erasure. They've got Vanderbilt too, man.
They do have.
What's going to happen?
But to be fair. Vandy is not going to game plan for any game for the rest of the year.
Just go for it, Diego.
Until November 2nd, when they go on the road and Diego Pavia decides to get that three-peat against Hugh Freeze in Auburn.
Oh my goodness, I can't wait for that. Well, one last thought, only because we haven't mentioned any ACC game. There's a couple of games out there because obviously Miami and SMU are off this week, but we've got a Cal team that isn't the greatest, but certainly can challenge. That's going to Pitt, undefeated Pitt, 5-0 Pitt. And we've got a Louisville team that is kind of reeling after 2 losses, going to a Virginia team that is 2-0 in the ACC. I mean, they had that kind of ugly loss to Maryland, but they're surprisingly sharing the top of the ACC standings. Any interesting games there, any angles there that have kind of got your mind?
I don't know. I mean, like we talked about, I think that 2 of the best teams in the ACC are off this week. I don't think that Clemson's going to do anything of note against Wake Forest. Like, that Cal Pitt game is kind of intriguing, partially because like we're waiting to see, because Pitt has been a team that's just survived so far, right? They had a crazy comeback against Cincy. They had a crazy comeback against West Virginia. They look fine against North Carolina. They would be bowl eligible if they win this game, which I think is pretty cool for them if they started 6-0 and got to a bowl that quickly. But like, I don't know. This is kind of a weird week in the ACC, and I mean, I'll watch the games, but I don't know that we're going to learn a whole lot from what happens this week.
Fair enough. I mean, certainly with Cade Bell and that Pitt offense, that'll be nice to see if they can reach a bowl. Because I think I know a lot of Pitt fans are very down on that team heading into the season, and it's been a pleasant surprise. Well, and it's funny, we got a quiet G5 week as well. I mean, the most interesting game of note is, can Boise survive the Hawaii trip? Because it's always a little weird on the islands. You're never entirely sure. But I agree, we're probably not going to see a whole lot there. So we'll go and wrap this one up. Just want to take a second to thank all of you for listening. We always appreciate when you join us to listen to our thoughts on college football. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you can, wherever you're listening to us, like, rate, and subscribe, write a review. We always appreciate it. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan J. Raja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hyeri, part of the group that runs Reddit CFB. Have a great weekend.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.